Welcome to Fireside Mysteries, my friends. I'm Alistair Blackwood, and there is nothing I love more than settling into a leather armchair with a glass of something amber while the wind howls outside and Hercule Poirot untangles the impossible. If you're curled up under a blanket, walking the dog in the crisp night air, or simply avoiding the washing up, do leave a comment below and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. I read every single one. Chapter 1. The House That Time Forgot. Snow was falling as though the sky had decided to bury England alive. Great soft flakes drifted past the tall windows of Ashenden Park, settling on the stone griffins that guarded the terrace, smoothing the ancient lawns into one vast, unmarked page. It was the 23rd of December, 1926, and the house stood waiting. Quiet, watchful, and far too beautiful for the things that were about to happen inside it. The drive from the station had been slow. The little train from Paddington had crawled through the white darkness, and the hired Daimler had crawled still slower, chains clanking over the frozen lanes. Hercule Poirot sat in the back, wrapped in the finest overcoat Bond Street could provide, a silk scarf about his throat, and a small leather case on the seat beside him containing three things he never traveled without: a box of tisanes, a clothes brush, and an intense dislike of the English winter. He disliked, too, the reason he had come: a telegram, 3 lines only, written in a woman's hand that shook so badly the paper looked drunk. "My husband believes someone intends to kill him. He laughs. I do not. Come before Christmas, I beg you." Poirot had met Sir Gervais Chevenix-Gore only once, at a dreary dinner in Claridge's 2 years earlier. The baronet had talked of fox hunting, the Empire, and the deplorable modern habit of young women bobbing their hair. He had possessed the sort of voice that expected the world to stand still while he spoke. Poirot had found him insufferable. Yet murder, even the threat of murder, was a serious business, and Poirot took murder seriously. So here he was, approaching a house he had never seen, invited by a woman he had never met to prevent a crime that might never happen. The car turned between gateposts topped with stone pineapples half smothered in snow, and the house appeared. Ashenden Park was one of those country palaces built by a man who wished the 18th century never to end. 3 long stories of rose-pink brick, a pediment supported by columns the size of elm trees, windows tall enough for giants. Even in the dark it glowed, lit from within like a lantern. A dozen chimneys poured pale smoke into the night, and every window blazed. Someone, somewhere inside, was determined to keep winter at bay with sheer expenditure of coal. The Daimler crunched to a halt. A footman in scarlet livery opened the door, and Poirot stepped out into air so cold it felt like a slap. He paused on the bottom step, turned up the collar of his coat, and looked at the house with the expression of a gourmet confronted by a dish he suspects will give him indigestion. "Mon Dieu," he murmured. "One hopes the central heating is magnificent." The front door opened before he reached it, and a butler of immense dignity appeared, flanked by 2 younger footmen who took Poirot's coat, his hat, his scarf, his gloves, and finally the small leather case which Poirot surrendered with reluctance. "Lady Chevenix-Gore is expecting you, sir," the butler said. His name, Poirot would later learn, was Musgrave, and he had been at Ashenden since the reign of King Edward. "If you would come this way." They passed through a hall that smelled of beeswax, holly, and centuries of money. A fire roared beneath a carved chimney-piece large enough to garage a small car. Above it hung a portrait of a bewigged Chevenix-Gore in the armor of a Knight of the Garter, looking down with the mild contempt of the long dead for the merely living. Voices drifted from a room on the right, laughter, the clink of glass, a woman's light protest. The house party was already in progress. Musgrave led him instead to a small sitting room where a single lamp burned and a woman waited alone. Lady Chevenix Gore rose as he entered. She was perhaps 50, tall, still beautiful in the way of women who have never quite believed in their own beauty. Her gown was silver lame, her pearls magnificent, but her eyes were frightened. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, and her voice trembled only a little. "You came." "I did not dare hope." Poirot bowed over her hand. "Madame, when a lady writes with such urgency, Hercule Poirot does not hesitate." She tried to smile. "My husband will mock me for this. He mocks everything now. But I have seen him looking at people, at our guests, as though measuring how much they hate him. And Gervais has a gift for being hated. Tell me of these guests." She moved to the fire, holding out hands that shook. "There are only 6 besides ourselves and Ruth, my daughter." "It is a small party this year," Gervais insisted. She spoke their names as though reciting a litany of worry. "Captain Hugo Trent, my husband's nephew. He will inherit if anything happens to Gervais before Ruth marries and has a son. Hugo is charming, but he is also £30,000 in debt. Colonel Barry, Gervais's oldest friend. They were at Eton together. The colonel lost everything in the crash of '24. He lives here now, on Gervais's charity. Sometimes charity is the cruelest thing one man can give another. Mr. John Lake, an architect. He has been surveying the East Wing, which is falling into ruin. Gervais engaged him, then quarreled with him, then threatened to ruin him. He is rather special to Ruth." Her voice caught on the last words. "And Miss Susan Cardwell," she finished. "Gervais's secretary these 5 years. She is efficient, clever, indispensable. Gervais treats her like a piece of furniture, sometimes worse." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "And your daughter, Miss Ruth?" "Ruth is 26. She is everything Gervais wanted in a son and nothing he wanted in a daughter. They fight like wildcats. She wishes to study medicine. Gervais says a Chevenix Gore's daughter does not cut up corpses for a living." Lady Chevenix Gore turned away suddenly. "I am frightening you with our domestic horrors. But last week Gervais received letters, anonymous, saying he would not see the new year. He burned them and laughed, but I saw his face." Poirot patted her hand with surprising gentleness. "Courage, madame. We shall see what we shall see." A gong sounded somewhere deep in the house, resonant and mournful. "Dinner," Lady Chevenix Gore said. "Will you come down? Gervais insisted you be invited once you arrived. He wishes to mock me in person, I expect." Poirot inclined his head. "I am desolated to deprive Sir Gervais of his amusement." They walked together along a corridor lined with ancestors. Somewhere a clock struck 9 with the slow certainty of something that has never been wrong. Poirot counted the strokes automatically, as was his habit. At the entrance to the drawing room, Lady Chevenix Gore paused. "Whatever happens, Monsieur Poirot," she whispered, "thank you for coming." Then she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and sailed into the room like a duchess entering a ballroom that happened to contain a guillotine. Poirot followed. 6 heads turned. 6 pairs of eyes measured the small, impeccably dressed foreigner with the magnificent mustache. Sir Gervais Chevenix Gore stood by the fireplace, a colossus in evening dress, his white tie as aggressive as a battle standard. "So," he boomed, "the famous Monsieur Poirot. My wife has imported a Belgian bloodhound to sniff out imaginary assassins. Welcome to Ashendon, sir. You will find no corpses here but the ones in the wine cellar, and they improve with age." Laughter rippled, dutiful and edged. Poirot bowed. "Sir Gervais, one is enchanted." He moved among them then, shaking hands, murmuring polite nothings, cataloguing everything. "Captain Hugo Trent, tall, fair, easy smile that did not quite reach the eyes. Colonel Barry, thin, sunburnt, the sort of man who looks permanently ready to apologize for existing. Ruth Chevenix Gore, dark hair cut in a defiant bob, green eyes that challenged the world and lost. John Lake, beside her, protective, already. Chapter 2. The shot in the sealed study dinner had been a slow, glittering torture. Sir Gervas held court at the head of the table, carving the roast beef with the same flourish he might have used to carve up an enemy regiment, telling the same stories he had told for 30 years, louder each time as though volume could make them fresh. The candles trembled in the draught from the great windows. The holly wreaths above the pictures looked on with prickly disapproval. Poirot, seated between Ruth Chevenix Gore and Miss Cardwell, observed everything and said almost nothing. Ruth's foot under the table brushed repeatedly against John Lake's. Lake flushed each time and pretended to be absorbed in his soufflé. Hugo Trent drank rather too much claret and laughed rather too loudly at his uncle's jokes. Colonel Barry stared at his plate as though it might bite him. Lady Chevenix Gore's pearls rose and fell with quick, shallow breaths. Only Susan Cardwell seemed perfectly calm, passing the sauces, refilling glasses, her red hair bright as danger beneath the chandelier. At 11:15, Sir Gervais pushed back his chair with a scrape that made the crystal sing. "Time for port and sanity," he announced. "The ladies may have their coffee. I have one last letter to dictate. Damned solicitors won't leave a man in peace even at Christmas." He strode from the dining room without waiting for reply. The door shut behind him with the finality of a judge's gavel. The party broke into uneasy fragments. Lady Chevenix Gore excused herself almost at once, pleading a headache. Ruth and John Lake disappeared in the direction of the conservatory. Hugo Trent and Colonel Barry took their port to the billiard room, the click of ivory balls soon drifting down the corridor like distant gunshots. Susan Cardwell gathered up her notebook and followed her employer upstairs, her heels tapping a brisk secretarial rhythm on the marble. Poirot lingered in the hall, warming his hands at the dying fire and listening to the house settle. Somewhere a clock ticked with ponderous authority. Outside, the snow kept falling, thick and silent. At 11:05, Susan Cardwell came downstairs again. She looked, Poirot noticed, unusually pale, and her hands twisted the notebook against her breast. "Sir Gervas says he will not need me after all," she told the empty air, though only Poirot was there to hear it. "He wishes to be alone." Poirot inclined his head. "One respects the desire for solitude." She hesitated, then walked quickly away toward the library. Silence returned, deeper now, the silence of a house holding its breath. 11:15 came and went. 11:20. Poirot had just decided to seek his bed. English country hours were barbaric when a single sound shattered the night. A gunshot, sharp, flat, unmistakable, coming from the first floor. For one astonished second, nobody moved. Then the house exploded into life. Hugo Trent burst from the billiard room, cue still in hand. Colonel Barry followed, face the color of putty. Ruth and John Lake appeared at the conservatory door, clinging to each other. Lady Chevenix Gore came running downstairs in her dressing gown, hair loose about her shoulders like a girl's. "Father!" Ruth cried. They ran upward in a body, feet thundering on the great staircase. Poirot, smaller and neater, arrived first at the study door. It was locked. Hugo put his shoulder to the oak. The door shuddered but held. Colonel Barry joined him. Together they heaved, and the ancient lock gave with a splintering crack. They stumbled into the room. Sir Gervas Chevenix Gore was slumped forward across the leather-topped desk, his head resting on his arms as though asleep. Blood, dark and shining, had spread across the blotter and dripped steadily onto the Persian rug. In his right hand, fingers still curled around it, lay a heavy service revolver. The single window stood ajar 6 inches, snowflakes drifting in on a breath of ice. Beneath it, the terrace lay white and untouched. Hugo reached his uncle first, touched the cheek, then recoiled. "He's dead." Lady Chevenix's gore gave one low, terrible moan and sank to the carpet. Ruth stood frozen in the doorway, hands pressed to her mouth. John Lake put an arm around her. She did not seem to feel it. Colonel Barry, moving like a man in a dream, crossed to the window and looked out. "No footprints," he said hoarsely. "Nothing. And the door was locked from the inside. The key's still there, look," he pointed. The big brass key glinted in the lock on the inside of the door they had just broken. Susan Cardwell appeared behind them, notebook forgotten somewhere, both hands clutching the door frame. On the blotter beneath Sir Gervais's outstretched arm, a sheet of crested notepaper bore 3 lines in his own impatient scrawl. "I have been betrayed by those I trusted most. There is only one honorable way left. Forgive me." The ink was scarcely dry. Hugo Trent turned away, face twisted. "My God, he shot himself." Colonel Barry nodded slowly. "Poor Gervais. Always said he'd go out with a soldier's death rather than linger." But Hercule Poirot did not nod. He stood very still in the center of the room, hands clasped behind his back, eyes moving with precision over every detail: the angle of the body, the position of the revolver, the open window, the untouched snow, the key in the lock, the note. At last he spoke softly, almost regretfully. "No," he said. "This is not suicide." Every head turned. "This," said Poirot, "is murder. Murder of the most audacious, the most insolent, the most beautifully staged. And the murderer, mes amis, is present in this very room." The snow went on falling outside, silent as secrets. Inside, no one moved at all. Chapter 3. The little gray cells, awakened Christmas morning, broke over Ashendon Park like a bad conscience, cold gray and far too bright. The snow had stopped some time before dawn, leaving the world muffled and glittering, every footprint from the night before erased, as though the house wished to pretend nothing had happened. In the breakfast room, the silver chafing dishes steamed, but nobody ate. The local inspector, a large, red-faced man named Major Riddell, had arrived at 9 o'clock with 2 constables and the comfortable conviction that suicides among the gentry were best left alone. He had examined the study, the note, the revolver, the untouched snow beneath the window, and the key on the inside of the door, and had announced his verdict with the relief of a man finishing a tiresome job. Suicide while temporarily insane. Sad business, but plain as daylight. We'll have the inquest after Boxing Day. No need to trouble the family further. He was already reaching for his gloves when Poirot spoke. "One moment, Major. You propose to dismiss the most impossible murder I have ever encountered as suicide?" "No. It will not do." Major Riddell swelled like an indignant turkey. "Impossible murder. Door locked from the inside, key on the inside, no footprints, note in the dead man's own hand. What would you call it, Mr. Poirot?" "I would call it genius," Poirot replied tranquilly. "And I would ask you to postpone your verdict until I have spoken to every person in this house. You may, of course, refuse, in which case I shall telephone Scotland Yard and explain that the Berkshire Constabulary prefers convenience to truth." Major Riddell looked at the small, immaculate foreigner with the egg-shaped head and the formidable mustache, and discovered that his comfortable certainty was melting like the snow on his boots. "Very well," he said at last. 24 hours. But I want this wrapped up tidy." Poirot bowed. "Tidiness is my passion." The interviews took place in the morning room, a pleasant apartment overlooking the rose garden now buried under 3 feet of white. A fire crackled. A constable stood outside the door. Poirot sat in a high-backed chair with a small table at his elbow, a cup of chocolate, which he had insisted upon. sending up fragrant steam. He began with the butler, Musgrave, who had heard nothing, seen nothing, and was desolated. He continued with the footman, the maids, the cook, none of whom had been above stairs after 10 o'clock. Then came the guests, one by one. Lady Chevenix Gore entered first, pale but composed in black. She sat very straight and answered quietly. Yes, her husband had been worried about money. Yes, he had quarreled with almost everyone in the house during the past fortnight. No, she had not left her room after retiring. Her maid could confirm it. She had taken 2 aspirin and slept badly. The shot had woken her. Poirot thanked her gravely and asked one question that made her fingers tighten on her handbag. "Madam, when did you last see your husband's service revolver?" The small one he kept in his dressing-room drawer. She hesitated only a fraction. "Months ago. Gervais disliked firearms in the house. He kept only the Colonel's old Webley for vermin." Poirot nodded and dismissed her. Captain Hugo Trent came next, smelling faintly of brandy and sleeplessness. He admitted freely that he had been £38,000 in debt and that his uncle's death made him a rich man under the old will. He had been playing billiards with Colonel Barry until the shot. He swore he had not left the billiard room. Colonel Barry, summoned immediately after, confirmed it, though his eyes avoided Poirot's. Ruth Chevenix Gore was defiant. Yes, she had quarreled with her father about John Lake, about medicine, about everything. Yes, she would have lost the estate under the new will her father had spoken of making. No, she did not kill him. She had been in the conservatory with John until the shot. John Lake, pale and furious, corroborated her story word for word. Colonel Barry was last of the morning. He walked with the stiff carefulness of a man who has drunk too much the night before and not enough to forget. The revolver, he said, had been his, taken from his room 2 days ago. He had not reported the theft because he assumed one of the servants had moved it for cleaning. He had no idea Sir Gervais had it. Poirot listened, eyes half closed, fingers steepled. When the Colonel had gone, Poirot sat silent for a long minute. Then he rang the bell. "Ask Miss Cardwell to come," he told the footman, "and bring me the typewriter from the secretary's office." Susan Cardwell entered briskly, notebook in hand, the perfect secretary. Only the faint shadows beneath her green eyes betrayed that she had slept as little as anyone else. Poirot wasted no time. "Mademoiselle, you were the last person to see Sir Gervais alive. You went upstairs with him after dinner." "Yes, he said he wished to dictate one letter. When we reached the study, he changed his mind and told me to go." "At what precise time did you leave him?" 11 minutes past 11. I looked at the grandfather clock on the landing." "And you went straight downstairs?" "I did." "Yet you told me last night that Sir Gervais said he would not need you after all. A small difference, but curious." Miss Cardwell did not flush or falter. I was flustered. The exact words escaped me. Poirot smiled suddenly, brilliantly. "We shall see." He placed a sheet of paper in the small Remington typewriter the footman had brought. "Be so good as to type the sentence you saw on the desk last night, exactly as it was written." She hesitated only a second, then sat and typed with quick, precise strokes. Poirot lifted the sheet and studied it. "Thank you, mademoiselle. That will be all, for the moment." When she had gone, he held the paper to the firelight, comparing it with the suicide note Major Riddell had reluctantly allowed him to examine. The original note contained one spelling mistake. The word receive was written receive, a mistake Sir Gervais was known to make all his life. The sheet Miss Cardwell had just typed spelled it perfectly. Poirot's eyes glittered. "Ah," he said softly to the empty room. "Now it becomes interesting." He rose, pulled the bell again, and asked that every clock in the house be brought to him before luncheon. The footman, mystified but obedient, began a solemn procession with mantel clocks, carriage clocks, and one tall case clock that required 3 men and much swearing. Poirot lined them up on the long table like soldiers for inspection. He examined each face, each set of hands. Then he smiled, a small, satisfied smile that would have chilled the heart of any guilty person watching. Outside, the winter sun climbed higher, turning the snow to 1,000,000 diamonds. Inside, the little gray cells of Hercule Poirot were very busy indeed. Chapter 4. Clues and red herrings. Poirot spent Christmas afternoon in the manner of a small, neat terrier worrying a very large bone. He moved through the house with a constable trailing behind like a bewildered bloodhound, measuring, tapping, peering, and occasionally uttering small exclamations of satisfaction that made Major Riddell's mustache bristle with suspicion. He began in the study itself. The body had been removed at dawn, coroner's orders, but the room remained untouched. Blood still darkened the leather desktop. The broken door hung drunkenly on its hinges. Poirot knelt, examined the key which had fallen inside when the door was forced, then lay flat on the turkey carpet and studied the gap beneath the door with the devotion of a pilgrim at a shrine. 3/16 of an inch, he murmured. More than enough. He rose, brushed imaginary dust from his knees, and turned his attention to the revolver. Colonel Barry's Webley, Army issue 1915, 6 chambers, 1 fired. The smell of cordite still lingered faintly. From the study he progressed to the gunroom next door, an oak-paneled chamber smelling of oil and old leather. Guns in racks, cartridges in boxes, a long table for cleaning. Poirot sniffed, opened drawers, lifted a green baize cloth that covered something on the table. Underneath lay a single spent cartridge case. He wrapped it carefully in his handkerchief. Next, he required the boots of every gentleman in the house. They were brought on a tray like trophies. Poirot examined soles, measured heels, compared them with faint marks on the gunroom floor that no one else had noticed. At 3:30 he summoned Susan Cardwell again and requested with exquisite politeness that she walk across the gunroom floor in her indoor shoes. She did so, red head high, green eyes defiant. Poirot watched the swing of her skirt and the placement of her feet and nodded once. Tea was served in the drawing room, but Poirot took only a cup of his own tisane and continued his perambulations. He interviewed the gardener, a grizzled veteran named Snell, who admitted that on the evening of the 23rd, Sir Gervais himself had ordered the terrace beneath the study window swept perfectly clean, in case burglars tried the ivy. "Burglars in December?" Poirot inquired gently. Snell shrugged. "Sir Gervais's orders, sir. He were very particular about appearances." By dusk, Poirot had accumulated a small pile of objects on the morning room table. The spent cartridge case, a burnt scrap of paper rescued from the study grate bearing the words, "No choice but to," a reel of fine black silk thread discovered in Miss Cardwell's workbasket, and a single red hair caught on the rough edge of the gunroom doorframe. Major Riddell watched the collection grow with the expression of a man watching his case dissolve. "None of this proves murder," he growled. "On the contrary," Poirot replied, "it proves everything except the name of the murderer, and that, mon cher Major, will not be long." Dinner that evening was a silent affair. The great table seemed larger with one place empty. Lady Chevenix's Gore had taken to her room. Ruth sat white-faced opposite Hugo Trent, who drank steadily. Colonel Barry carved the cold beef as though performing an autopsy. John Lake kept glancing toward the door as if expecting Sir Gervais to march in and demand to know why they were all looking so Thursday-faced. Susan Cardwell alone retained her composure, passing bread sauce and pouring wine with the calm of a woman who has nothing left to hide, or everything. After dinner, Poirot requested that the entire household assemble in the library. When they were gathered, 7 pale faces and Major Riddell, he stood before the fire and began very softly to speak. "You will forgive me if I appear theatrical, but murder is always theater, n'est-ce pas? Let us examine what we know. Sir Gervais was shot with Colonel Barry's revolver, yet the colonel swears it was stolen 2 days ago. Curious. Captain Trent benefits enormously from his uncle's death under the old will. But there is talk of a new will, witnessed only 3 days ago, which disinherits Miss Ruth entirely. Curious again. Mr. Lake was threatened with professional ruin only yesterday morning. Miss Ruth would have lost everything she expected. Lady Chevenix Gore discovered her husband intended to sell the Rubens, her family's treasure, to pay gambling debts. Colonel Barry lives on Sir Gervais's charity and perhaps resented it more than he admits. Miss Cardwell typed the new will and has been treated, she feels, as less than dust. Everyone, in short, has motive. Everyone has lied about something small. And yet, the door locked from within, the key inside, the window 30 feet above untouched snow, the note in Sir Gervais's hand. Impossible. Unless one understands that impossibility is the murderer's signature. He paused. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moaned in the chimneys like a soul in pain. Poirot smiled suddenly. "Tomorrow," he said, "we shall reconstruct the crime, and the murderer will assist me, whether they wish it or not." Hugo Trent laughed, a sharp, unpleasant sound. "You'll look a fool if it turns out to be suicide after all, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot regarded him with benevolent pity. "My dear, Captain Hercule Poirot has never looked a fool in his life. It would be a new experience, and one I assure you I do not intend to have." He bowed, wished them good night, and departed, leaving behind him a room full of people who suddenly found the fire gave very little warmth. Upstairs, in the quiet of his bedroom, Poirot opened his little notebook and wrote 3 words in neat, sloping script: thread, timing, performance. He underlined the last word twice, closed the book, and permitted himself a small, satisfied smile. The little gray cells were singing. Chapter 5. Complications and Twists. The house slept uneasily that night, as though aware that the game was entering its final act. Snow began again shortly after midnight, soft and relentless, erasing whatever traces the day had left. Inside, clocks ticked with different voices, some fast, some slow, turning time itself into a liar. Poirot did not sleep at all. He sat in darkness by his bedroom window, watching the white garden and listening. At 20 minutes past 2, he heard it. The faintest creak on the back staircase, the whisper of a door that should have stayed shut. He rose, slipped on dressing gown and slippers, and moved like a silent black cat along the corridor. He was too late to see the figure, but he found the aftermath. A scream, high, terrified, unmistakably female, tore through the stillness. It came from the far end of the guest wing. Poirot ran faster than any man who looked so plump had a right to run, and arrived with Hugo Trent and John Lake only seconds behind. Susan Cardwell's door stood wide. She was on her knees in the center of the rug, nightgown torn at the shoulder, red hair wild, staring at the window. Snow blew in through the open casement. On the floor lay a small Derringer pistol, mother-of-pearl handle gleaming. He tried to kill me," she gasped. "A man in black, mask, came through the window. I fought, he dropped the gun and climbed out again." Hugo slammed the window shut while Lake helped Susan to a chair. Footprints, clear, deep, led from the flower bed below to the sill and away again across the fresh snow. They stopped abruptly 20 yards from the house, as though the intruder had taken flight like a bird. Major Riddell, summoned in his nightshirt, stared at the tracks and the pistol with the expression of a man whose nice, tidy suicide had grown fangs. The Derringer was registered to Sir Gervais himself. kept in the same drawer as his dress studs. No one had seen it since the previous summer. Susan Cardwell, wrapped now in a quilt, drank brandy with shaking hands and repeated her story. A gloved hand over her mouth, the cold circle of a gun barrel at her temple, her own scream as she twisted free. Poirot listened without comment, eyes glittering. When she finished, he asked only one question. "Mademoiselle, when you fought your attacker, did you by chance seize his mask?" She stared. I clawed at his face. I felt the edge of the mask, yes. "And did any part of it come away in your hand?" She opened her clenched fist. A scrap of black silk, torn and ragged, lay on her palm. Poirot took it delicately between thumb and forefinger. "Curious," he murmured. "The very same silk as the thread in your work-basket, non?" Color drained from her face, then rushed back twice as red. Hugo Trent gave a short, incredulous laugh. "Good God! Are you suggesting Miss Cardwell staged her own attack?" "I suggest nothing," Poirot replied. "I observe." Dawn found the house in uproar. Major Riddell telephoned for more men. Lady Chevenix's Gore fainted clean away when told someone had tried to murder the secretary the night after her husband shot himself. Ruth and John Lake clung together like children in a thunderstorm. Colonel Barry locked himself in the gunroom and refused to come out. Poirot, apparently unmoved by the chaos he had created, requested breakfast in the morning room and ate 2 croissants with his usual precision. When Major Riddell burst in demanding explanations, Poirot merely raised a finger. "Patience, mon ami. The second attack is the murderer's great mistake. It tells us 2 things. First, that the murderer is still among us, and second, that the murderer is an artist who cannot resist an encore." He wiped his lips delicately. "Today we reconstruct the impossible crime. Everyone will attend. The snow has done us the favor of preserving every footprint since midnight. We shall see whose boots match the assassin's." At 11 o'clock, the entire household, servants included, gathered on the terrace beneath the study window. The snow was crisp, the sky iron gray. Poirot stood wrapped in an enormous fur coat like a small, fastidious bear. He began with the footprints from Susan Cardwell's window. They were narrow, elegant, unmistakably a woman's court shoe. Susan herself, pale but composed in a dark coat, was made to stand beside the prints. Her foot, when placed in one, fitted perfectly. Silence fell, thick as the snow. Susan Cardwell lifted her chin. "I was attacked. Those are the prints of the man escaping." Escaping by walking backward in his own footprints for 20 yards and then vanishing? Poirot inquired gently. "Come, mademoiselle. Even a magician would applaud such virtuosity." Hugo Trent stepped forward angrily. "Then you're accusing her of murdering my uncle as well?" Poirot turned to him, eyes suddenly sharp. "No, Captain, I am accusing her of something far more revealing: panic." The perfect crime was complete. Locked room, suicide note, no footprints. Yet someone grew frightened that Poirot saw too clearly. So a second drama was staged to suggest an outside killer still at large. But the artist overreached. Black silk torn from her own mask, footprints too perfectly placed, and the Derringer, Sir Gervais's little gun, conveniently dropped. Susan's control snapped. "You can't prove anything." "On the contrary," Poirot said softly, "I can prove everything. But first we reconstruct the first murder. Inside, if you please." They filed into the house like a funeral procession. The study door had been temporarily repaired. The desk stood as it had on Christmas Eve. Poirot placed Colonel Bury's Webley on the blotter. "Now," he said, "we require a volunteer to play the corpse." No one moved. Poirot's gaze settled on Susan Cardwell. "Mademoiselle, since you know the staging so intimately, perhaps you will oblige." Her face went white as the snow outside. The net was closing, and every soul in the room could feel it. Chapter 6. The Reconstruction. The library at Ashenden Park had never felt so small. Every chair was taken, every inch of carpet occupied by someone who wished to be elsewhere. The great windows showed nothing but white. The fire hissed as melting snow dripped from coats. Major Riddell stood by the door with 2 constables. No one was leaving until Poirot allowed it. Poirot himself stood before the marble mantel, small and immaculate, hands clasped behind his back. The silence was absolute. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, voice soft yet carrying to the furthest corner. "We are about to watch a murder committed a second time. Only this time the murderer will be obliged to show us exactly how it was done." He turned to Susan Cardwell. She stood between Ruth and Lady Chevenix's gore, face bloodless, lips pressed so tightly together they had disappeared. "Mademoiselle, you will play yourself. Colonel Barry, you will kindly lend us your revolver once more. It is unloaded. There is no danger." The colonel handed over the Webley as though it burned him. Poirot took it, weighed it in his palm, then laid it on a silver tray a footman held. "First, we must establish where the shot was really fired. Not in the study. In the gun room next door." He led the way. The company followed like sleepwalkers. The gun room smelled still of oil and brass. Poirot pointed to faint marks on the floor, scuffs no one had noticed before. "Observe." Sir Gervais stood here, facing the door. The murderer entered behind him. 1 shot to the right temple, death instantaneous. The sound muffled by these thick walls and the baize door reached the hall as a distant pop. Enough to startle, not enough to locate precisely. He positioned Hugo Trent as the victim, placed Susan Cardwell behind him, holding the revolver at the correct angle. Sir Gervais was not a tall man. Mademoiselle is 5'8" in her stockings. The wound slopes slightly upward. Perfect. Susan's hand shook. The revolver barrel wavered. Poirot continued calmly. "Now the body must be moved next door and arranged as a suicide." Sir Gervais weighed 11 stone, not light, but a determined woman can drag 11 stone 20 feet when fury lends her strength. He demonstrated with Hugo, who allowed himself to be pulled across the floor, arms above his head. "Observe the heels, leave almost no trace on the thick carpet. 10 seconds, no more." They passed into the study. The desk waited, blotters still faintly brown. Poirot arranged Hugo's body exactly as Sir Gervais had lain, head on arms, revolver in right hand. "Now the door, the illusion upon which everything depends." He produced the reel of fine black silk thread, taken from Susan's own work basket that morning, and a small brass clock weight no larger than a walnut. "Watch carefully." He closed the study door, leaving only a finger's breadth open. The key was in the lock on the inside. He passed the thread through the key, looped it twice, then let the weight dangle outside. A gentle tug. The key turned smoothly. Another tug. The thread slipped free, the weight dropped into his waiting palm, and the key remained inside as though it had never moved. A collective intake of breath rippled through the room. The gap beneath the door is generous in a house this old. The thread is drawn back under, invisible against the dark runner. 30 seconds from first shot to locked door. Child's play for someone who has practiced. Susan Cardwell made a small, strangled sound. Poirot turned to her almost kindly. "You made only 2 mistakes, mademoiselle. First, you typed the suicide note in advance, but you corrected the spelling of receive. Sir Gervais never could spell it correctly. Everyone knew that. Second, you burned a different letter in the grate. One beginning, 'Forgive me, but I have no choice.' That letter was from Miss Ruth to Mr. Lake. You kept it to blackmail them later, perhaps. But the fragment remained." He held up the scorched scrap. Susan stared at it as though it were a death warrant. "And the terrace swept clean?" Major Riddell demanded. Sir Gervais ordered it himself 2 days earlier on instructions from his secretary, who told him burglars might use the ivy. A clever woman turns even the victim's vanity into a weapon. Lady Chevenix's Gore gave a low moan and covered her face. Poirot's voice softened. Mademoiselle, you wished Sir Gervais dead because he promised marriage years ago, then laughed when you reminded him. You discovered he intended to dismiss you penniless after falsifying accounts to avoid death duties, accounts you yourself typed. When he spoke of a new will cutting out Ruth, you saw your chance for a larger revenge, to frame the entire household and walk away blameless. Susan Cardwell looked slowly around the circle of faces, some shocked, some pitying, none surprised any longer. Then quite suddenly her shoulders sagged. It was so perfect, she whispered. For one night it was perfect. She held out her wrists to Major Riddell without being asked. The constables stepped forward. The click of handcuffs sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Poirot watched her led away, then turned to the others. The performance is over. You may applaud the criminal if you wish. She was, in her way, magnificent. But Hercule Poirot prefers to applaud truth. Chapter 7. Justice served. The library windows were open for the first time in days, letting in a cold, clean wind that carried away the smell of grief and cordite. Outside, the snow had begun to slide from the eaves in heavy wet slabs. The world was preparing to forget its white disguise. Inside, the household sat in the same chairs that had held them during the reconstruction. But the atmosphere was entirely different, stunned, exhausted, almost peaceful. Susan Cardwell had been taken to the small room that served as the estate office. Major Riddell had telephoned for a police car from Reading. It would arrive within the hour. Until then, the secretary sat very straight at the desk where she had typed so many letters, so many lies, with a constable on either side and her hands folded in her lap as though she were merely waiting for dictation. Poirot entered alone, closing the door softly behind him. She looked up. The mask of efficiency had fallen away. What remained was a woman of 29 who suddenly looked 40, handsome rather than pretty and very tired. You want my confession in writing, she said. It was not a question. If you please, mademoiselle, for the sake of tidiness. She gave a small, bitter laugh. Tidiness, of course. She took a sheet of ashen-encrusted notepaper, uncapped her fountain pen, and began to write in her neat, rapid secretary's hand. Poirot watched without comment. When she had finished, 3 pages, closely written, she blotted the sheets, folded them once, and handed them over. It is all there, she said. Every detail, even the ones you did not guess. He inclined his head. You are generous. I am finished, she corrected. There is a difference. She leaned back in the chair, eyes on the window where rooks wheeled against a clearing sky. I loved him, you know. In the beginning. He could be charming when he wished. He promised marriage once after his wife, after Lady Chevenix's Gore lost the child and turned away from him. He said I was the only woman who truly understood him. Then Ruth grew up, and the estate needed an heir of the blood, and promises became jokes told over brandy. Her voice was perfectly steady. When I found the forged accounts he wanted me to type, hiding money from the taxmen from his own daughter, I knew I was to be thrown away like a worn nib. I planned for 6 months. The thread came from a mourning dress I never wore. The weight was from an old clock in the attic. I practiced the key trick until I could do it blindfold. She looked at Poirot directly. You were right about the second attack. Panic. I thought if I made it seem an outsider still threatened us, you would look away from the house. Stupid. I should have known you never look away. Poirot placed the confession in his pocket. And the derringer? A flourish. Gervais kept it for theatricals. He liked to play the country squire defending his hearth. I thought a woman's weapon would confuse things further. She smiled without humor. I really was quite brilliant, wasn't I? Brilliant, yes, and terribly lonely. For the first time her composure cracked. Tears filled her eyes but did not fall. Will they hang me? In this year of 1926, for a woman almost certainly transportation for life. Perhaps with good conduct you will see England again. She nodded slowly, accepting the sentence as she had once accepted dictation. When the police car crunched up the drive 20 minutes later, she walked out between the constables with her head high and her coat unbuttoned despite the cold. The household watched from the windows. No one spoke. Ruth began to cry quietly against John Lake's shoulder. Lady Chevenix's Gore stood like a statue, one gloved hand pressed to the glass. Susan paused on the top step, turned once, and looked straight at Poirot where he stood in the doorway. "Thank you," she said clearly enough for everyone to hear, "for making it matter." Then she was gone. The car disappeared between the gateposts, leaving only parallel tracks in the slush that the next snow would cover. That evening, Major Riddell departed with his men in a thick file of statements. The broken study door was removed for repairs. The blood-stained blotter burned in the kitchen range. Servants moved through the house on silent feet, laying fires, drawing curtains against the early dark. Dinner was served at 8, but only 4 people came down: Poirot, Ruth, John Lake, and surprisingly Colonel Barry. Lady Chevenix's Gore had taken a tray in her room. Hugo Trent had driven away in his uncle's Bentley an hour after the police car, saying he needed air and would be back tomorrow. No one expected him to return. The meal was simple: clear soup, roast chicken, a lemon soufflé, but the silence was companionable rather than strained. When the cloth was drawn and port placed before Colonel Barry, Poirot raised his glass of tisane. "Two absent friends," he said quietly. They drank. Afterwards, in the drawing room, Ruth asked the question no one else had dared. "Monsieur Poirot, the new will, the one cutting me out, was it real?" Poirot shook his head. "Entirely forged by Mademoiselle Cardwell, though your father had spoken of making one. The witnesses, 2 gardeners, admitted this afternoon they signed a blank sheet for what they thought was a harmless petition. Your father's true will, made in 1924, leaves everything to you and your mother jointly. Captain Trent will receive a legacy of £5,000, enough to pay his most pressing debts, no more." Ruth closed her eyes in relief. John Lake took her hand openly now. No one pretended not to see. Colonel Barry cleared his throat. "And the Rubens?" "Safe," Poirot assured him. Sir Gervais's gambling debts were exaggerated by his secretary to increase her own grievance. There will be economies, but Ashendon Park remains. The colonel's old eyes filled. "Gervais was a difficult man," he said gruffly, "but he was my friend. I shall miss him." "We all miss something," Poirot replied. "Even the worst of men leave a space when they go." Later, when the fire burned low and the others had gone to bed, Poirot stood alone in the hall beneath the great chandelier. Musgrave appeared as butlers do from nowhere. "Will there be anything else, sir?" Poirot considered the quiet house, the ticking of the long case clock, the faint scent of holly and beeswax. "Only one thing, my friend. Tell me, when you have known a house for 40 years, you know its secrets. Was Sir Gervais truly hated by so many?" Musgrave allowed himself the ghost of a smile. "Sir Gervais was hated by many, sir, but he was loved by no one quite so fiercely as he was hated by Miss Cardwell. In the end, that was the only love he ever truly earned." Poirot nodded slowly. "Then justice," he said, "has indeed been served." He climbed the stairs to his room, walking through patches of moonlight that lay across the carpet like spilled salt. salt to purify, moonlight to remember. Behind him, Ashendene Park settled into its old sleep, wounded but healing, waiting for spring. Chapter 8. Epilogue. Brandy by the Fire. The last day of the old year arrived at Ashendene Park wrapped in a pale, reluctant sun. The snow had shrunk to dirty ridges along the hedges. Rooks quarreled in the elms. Somewhere a thrush practiced its spring song as though testing whether the world deserved it yet. Hercule Poirot came down late, having spent the morning packing with the meticulous care of a man who believes chaos begins with a crooked tie. In the hall, he found the post had brought a thick cream envelope addressed in Ruth Chevenix's Gore's impatient scrawl. He slit it open with the silver knife Musgrave provided. Monsieur Poirot, thank you. Seemed too small for everything we owe you. John and I are engaged. We shall marry in April quietly, and I shall begin my medical studies in the autumn. Father would have roared like a wounded bull, but father is gone, and I think in some strange way he has left me freer than he ever did in life. Mother has decided to open the East Wing to convalescent children next summer. She says the house is too large for ghosts. The Rubens stays where it has hung for 200 years. Colonel Barry has accepted the position of estate manager. He wept when we offered it, but soldiers are allowed to weep when nobody is looking. Hugo has sold the Bentley and paid enough debts to keep the bailiffs away. He has taken a commission in Kenya and sails next month. I think the Empire will suit him. There is plenty of room for noise. We none of us know how to thank you. Will you come back one day and let us try? Your grateful friend. Ruth Poirot folded the letter, touched and slipped it into his breast pocket next to his heart. An uncharacteristic gesture he would have denied if observed. At noon he took a turn on the terrace. The air smelled of wet earth and wood smoke. The sky had the color of a pigeon's breast. Footsteps crunched behind him, and he turned to find Lady Chevenix's Gore wrapped in sables, a woman who had begun to look forward instead of back. Monsieur Poirot, she said, I have kept you from your train. Trains to London are many, madame. Moments such as this are few. She smiled, the first real smile he had seen from her. I came to say goodbye properly, and to give you this. She held out a small leather box. Inside on black velvet lay a tie pin, a tiny enameled snowflake surrounding a perfect seed pearl. It is nothing, she said, compared to a life restored, but it will remind you that winter always ends. Poirot bowed over her hand with old-fashioned grace. Madame, you give me spring in the middle of winter. I am desolated to leave. They walked together to the waiting car. The chauffeur stood ready. Musgrave held the door. Colonel Barry appeared at the last moment, ramrod straight in an ancient ulster, and shook Poirot's hand with a grip that threatened bones. Damned good show, sir, he said gruffly. Gervais was a fool about many things, but he was right to trust you. Ruth and John Lake came running from the stables, cheeks pink, eyes shining. Ruth kissed Poirot on both cheeks without ceremony. You will write? She demanded. I am a poor correspondent, Poirot warned, but for you I shall make an exception. The car moved off down the drive between the stone pineapples now bare and dripping. Poirot looked back once. They stood in a small group on the steps, Lady Chevenix's Gore, Ruth, John, the Colonel, even Musgrave, waving as though they were a family and he belonged to it. The journey to London was uneventful. At Paddington, he took a taxi straight to his flat in Whitehall Court. The concierge greeted him with relief. The central heating, it seemed, had behaved perfectly in his absence. Poirot climbed the stairs slowly, savoring the familiar smell of polish and the faint echo of his own footsteps. Inside, everything was exactly as he had left it. The square chairs, the geometrical fireplace, the bust of himself, slightly improved, that his friend Epstein had insisted upon. He laid hat and gloves aside with a sigh of pure contentment. A fire was laid. He lit it, drew his favorite chair close, and rang for George. "Champagne, I think," he said when his valet appeared. "And some of those little almond biscuits if Madame has not eaten them all." George permitted himself a smile. "Welcome home, sir." When the tray arrived, Poirot poured a single glass, raised it to the flames, and spoke aloud to the empty room. "To order restored," he said. "To a house that will laugh again. And to a woman who tried to murder with perfection and almost succeeded." He sipped, eyes half closed, letting the bubbles dance on his tongue. Outside, London began its cautious preparations for a new year. Bells practicing in the steeples, taxis hooting, a distant band playing Auld Lang Syne badly but with enthusiasm. Inside, the fire settled into a steady glow, and Hercule Poirot, for the first time in 10 days, allowed himself to do absolutely nothing at all. Later, much later, when the clock struck 12 and the sky over the Thames filled with rockets, he lifted his glass again. "Bonne année," he murmured, "and may all our locked rooms open gently." He drank the last of the champagne, set the glass carefully on the mantel, and went to bed. In the quiet that follows great events, Ashenden Park and Whitehall Court both slept soundly, dreaming of spring. Chapter 9. A quiet word from your host. And there we must leave Hercule Poirot, closing the door of his flat with the satisfied click of a man who has put the world back into its proper shape. The fire is low, the Thames is dark, and somewhere in the distance Big Ben is still clearing its throat for the new year. My friends, if you've stayed with me through every creak of that old country house staircase, every whisper of snow against the window panes, then you deserve a moment of quiet yourself. Take a breath, stretch, refill whatever kept you company tonight. Tea, wine, something stronger. I don't judge. You've just lived through a perfect locked-room murder solved by the most meticulous little Belgian who ever twirled a mustache. Before you drift off, because I know many of you listen to these long tales precisely to fall asleep to them, let me ask the questions I always ask when the library fire burns down to embers. Who did you suspect first? Was it ruthless Hugo with his mountain of debts? Ruth and her forbidden love? Poor Colonel Barry and his missing revolver? Or did some of you, the sharp ones, spot the quiet woman in the corner who typed faster than she spoke and never quite met anyone's eyes? And when the silk thread came out, that tiny black thread that locked a door from the wrong side, did you feel the same delicious shiver I did the first time I read Christie's own impossible crimes? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, no matter how late the hour or how far across the world you are. Some of you listen in Tokyo subways at rush hour. Some in the wilds of Canada with wolves howling outside. Some, I'm told, in hospital beds when sleep is the best medicine going. Wherever you are tonight, know that I'm grateful for your company. If this was your first fireside mystery, welcome. If you've been here since the earliest whispered tales, thank you for keeping the fire alight. Either way, do 3 small kindnesses before you close your eyes. 1. Tap that subscribe button if you haven't already. It costs nothing and keeps the library warm. 2. Leave a like so the algorithm knows these slow, old-fashioned stories still matter in a world that scrolls too fast. 3. Tell me where you're listening from. I keep a map on the wall behind me, and every new pin feels like a friend dropping by for brandy. Next week, we return with another full-length mystery. Something set aboard a night train this time, because nothing makes the miles slip by like a body in a sleeping compartment, and no one who could possibly have done it. Until then, keep your doors locked if you must, but leave your mind wide open. The impossible happens most often to those who refuse to believe in it. This is Alistair Blackwood, somewhere in the quiet south of England, raising a final glass to you, to Poirot, and to the comforting knowledge that however clever the criminal order and a small man with magnificent mustaches, will always have the last word. Good night, my dear companions. Sleep well. Dream of snow falling softly over country houses where justice eventually always comes in from the cold. Chapter 10. The house was silent at last. Not the brittle, listening silence of the past week when every creak might have been a footstep and every closing door a threat, but a deeper, kinder quiet, the kind that settles after a long fever has broken. The clocks had been set right, the blood scrubbed from the study carpet, the broken door replaced with new oak that still smelled of the sawmill. Ashenden Park breathed out and for the first time in years did not breathe in fear. Poirot lingered one extra night. He told himself it was because the London trains were uncertain after snow, but in truth he wanted to see the place settle, the way a doctor lingers to be sure the pulse is steady. He found Lady Chevenix's gore in the long gallery at dusk, alone among the ancestors. The Rubens glowed in the last light, richer now that no one was planning to sell it. She stood beneath it in a simple black dress, pearls put away, hair touched with silver she no longer bothered to hide. I used to hate this picture, she said without turning. My father-in-law bought it to prove he belonged among dukes. Gervase kept it to prove he was greater than dukes. I think Ruth will keep it simply because it is beautiful. Poirot came to stand beside her. Beauty is the best reason of all, madame. She smiled, small and real. Will you walk with me once around the gallery before you go? I find I no longer mind the eyes of the dead. They walked slowly past bewigged generals and severe Chevenix gore brides, past a small Gainsborough of a boy with a hoop who had died at sea a week later. At the far end a new gap waited where a minor Reynolds had hung until dry rot claimed the frame. Tomorrow a restorer would come. I have dismissed the idea of selling anything, she said. We shall open the east wing to children instead. Ruth insists the house must earn its keep by doing good. I think she is right. They paused before a window that looked over the terrace. The snow was almost gone. Only a few ghostly patches remained beneath the yews. You gave us back our future, she said quietly. I do not know how to repay that. Poirot twirled the stem of the snowflake tie-pin between finger and thumb. One is repaid already, madame. When a house chooses life instead of death, Hercule Poirot is rich indeed. A bell rang faintly somewhere below. Dinner, or the first post, or simply the house remembering its routines. Lady Chevenix Gore rested her hand on his sleeve. Come down when you are ready. Ruth has persuaded cook to attempt your favorite sole. We insist on feeding you properly before we let you escape. She left him alone with the portraits and the quiet. Poirot stayed a moment longer studying the empty space where the Reynolds had been. In his mind, he placed another picture there. Not a painting, but a memory. Susan Cardwell walking out between constables, head high, thanking him for making her crime matter. A dangerous woman, brilliant and ruined. He felt no triumph, only the familiar ache that came when the little gray cells solved everything except the human heart. He turned away. In the hall, Musgrave waited with his coat, scarf, and gloves laid out like ceremonial armor. The car is at the door, sir. And Miss Ruth asked me to give you this. He handed over a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, blank except for the first page where Ruth had written in her bold, impatient hand, "For the next impossible crime. Do not dare solve it without visiting us first. R.C.G." Poirot laughed softly, the sound echoing under the vaulted ceiling. Tell Miss Ruth, he said, that Hercule Poirot never refuses a challenge, especially when soul in the Norman style is promised. The Daimler purred down the drive between the stone pineapples now dripping like thawing wedding cakes. In the back seat, Poirot opened the notebook again, took out his fountain pen, and wrote a single line on the second page. At Ashenden Park, even the snow learned that nothing is impossible when order and a woman's heart are both broken. He closed the book, slipped it into his pocket beside Ruth's letter, and watched the great house shrink in the rear window until it was no larger than a child's toy. Then the car turned between the gates, the pines closed behind it, and Ashenden Park was gone. London swallowed him again. Smoke, horns, the smell of wet streets and chestnuts. Yet something of the country house traveled with him. The faint scent of holly, the memory of a fire that had finally warmed instead of threatened. The knowledge that somewhere a difficult old estate was turning its face toward spring. In his flat that night, Poirot arranged the snowflake tie-pin in its velvet box on the mantel beside a small photograph he had taken from the gallery table as a keepsake. The four of them on the steps waving goodbye. Lady Chevenix Gore, Ruth, John Lake, Colonel Barry, with Musgrave a respectful step behind. They looked, he thought, like people who had survived a shipwreck and discovered the shore was kinder than they remembered. He poured a last tisane, raised the cup to the photograph, and spoke aloud in the quiet room. "To life," he said, "which is always, in the end, the only mystery worth solving." Then he turned off the lamps, leaving only the glow of the fire and the soft London night pressing against the windows, and slept without dreaming of locked doors or falling snow. Outside, 1926 slipped quietly into 1927, and somewhere far away a thrush sang once experimentally to see if the world was ready.